Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. As always, I'm your host, Killian, managing editor for Being Libertarian, LLC. In today's episode, I'm going to jump right ahead here and talk about gun rights. Now, as most of you are well aware, recently there was the gun right rally in Virginia in regards to some of the rather restrictive laws that let's just call him Governor Blackface, considering some of his high school posters. I've got no respect for the man in general for some of those stances, and also just his political stances pretty much throughout his career. His assault on gun rights is probably the most recent one that I have an issue with, but I'm not going to really focus on him or Virginia or the gun right rally itself. It should be noted that despite how many people were sadly hoping for some kind of violent outburst to take place at the rally, it was actually very peaceful. In a lot of ways, it was more diverse than a lot of the Occupy rallies, which just kind of makes me laugh internally there. More importantly, though, they were very clean, very organized, very peaceful. They came for exactly what they wanted to talk about. And then once they were done their time, they dispersed and moved on. What's interesting, I find, though, when we're talking about gun rights, because like I said, I don't want to focus too much on the rally itself. There's going to be other podcasts on this network, and pretty much any other liberty-oriented podcast network is going to be touching on the rally itself. I want to take this as an opportunity to discuss the importance of gun rights in and of themselves. Now, when we consider rights, just the concept of rights, which I think on a different episode has been called a very nebulous concept. Little in-joke there, but anyway. Gun rights are a precursor to many of the other rights that we try to consider. So when we talk about rights, there's tons of different competing theories on what makes something a right. There's the positive rights theory, which is if there's a so-called thing that we like to call society, that a society should be able to provide XYZ for its citizenry. This is where you get the right to healthcare arguments, right to education arguments, so on and so forth. Those on the more libertarian side tend to lean towards negative concepts of rights, which is the right to be left alone, which means that you have the right to do things without interference rather than having other people have to act on rights for you. To better explain the distinction, in order to have a positive right, like a right to healthcare, you would need to have people fulfilling that right for you. That means you have a right to the services of other people. As such, most libertarians disagreeing with the concept of anybody having to do anything for anybody outside of explicit voluntary agreement heavily disagree with the concept of positive rights. Not so much not just a tax dollar thing or a market restriction thing, so much as it's that key concept of having a right to someone else's labor. Negative rights, on the other hand, need nothing from other people except for inaction. So a right to freedom of speech only requires that other people do not try to silence you. A right to freedom of movement only requires that others do not try to impede you. A lot of what we would consider core, or I would even say normal rights, stem from the idea of negative rights rather than positive rights. Gun rights, though, gun rights are an interesting one because you have a right to bear arms. That doesn't mean that you have the positive right where the government has to give you a gun. I mean, I'm pretty sure many libertarians would be completely okay with that level of overreach if the state just started handing out firearms to everybody. But that's not the point of it. The idea of having a right to bear arms, not just in the American constitutional sense, but just as a conceptual right in and of itself, to have a right to bear arms means that you have the right to protect and defend yourself without other people interfering with your ability to do so. Now, this doesn't mean that the right to bear arms or the right to protect yourself automatically translates that other people aren't allowed to attack you. I mean, they're not supposed to be attacking you. It's the reason we consider it assault, or the reason why the concept of lethal defensive force is considered acceptable in modern society as one of the few forms of lethal force that we consider okay, both morally and just societally. But the main thing with it is that it's a precursor to upholding a lot of the other rights that you have. So, considering that a lot of negative rights are based on the concept of simply being left alone, the idea that other people do not interfere with your ability to do X, Y, Z. What do you do when people try to? What is the deterrent other than this vague concept that we're all supposed to respect each other enough to not do that to each other? Now, in most countries, they have a Bill of Rights, in which case the government's the one that steps in to ensure that these rights are enforced. But if we're talking from a libertarian perspective or from an anarchist perspective, or even just a solution outside of the state, how do we reinforce our own rights? We can have different agreements to it, but people can violate agreements. And the idea of having an explicit written contract between every person in society that they will uphold the rights of each other at risk of censure, lawsuit, or whatever else seems, well, it's a pipe dream. It's a completely ridiculous idea, or in a ridiculous expectation to set, if that's the way that you view these things being resolved. There is no perfectly pacifist way of ensuring that rights continue. Now, before I get into the gun argument a little bit better here, one thing that I should add when it comes to rights is that the argument on the origin of rights is still something that is heavily debated. Some people view rights as God-given. Some people view rights strictly in what is allotted by the government, i.e. what the government swears to protect you from. So this is where a lot of the arguments for constitutional rights come in versus just rights as a concept on their own. But then you have different social theories of rights. There's Rousseau's social contract theory, which overreaches a fair amount. If you get the chance, side note here, there's a wonderful book on it I think I've plugged before. Wonderful book on it called The Myth of the Social Contract. It was written by Andrew Kern from The Principled Libertarian. Excellent book, short read, but if you had any concept of holding on to the social construct, the social contract as a positive idea or as something that was a little more cement than it is, that book will completely destroy that argument entirely. I cannot recommend it enough. It's available on Amazon, but I'll move on. When you look at other philosophers, some of them had the idea of rights as a just pure social construct, which they are. It's something that we as society have created an idea of. They're not something that have any physical weight to them. They're not an actual object. They're simply a concept. The creation of these concepts, though, some people believe that it's based on pure logical observation of man and nature. So that's where I'm really simplifying when I say that. I could spend an entire episode talking about it, but that's where the concept of natural rights come from. Just what rights would you have if you were a creature alone in nature? And that would include right to protect yourself, right to move, right to speak, so on and so forth. A couple others have involved almost social evolutionary theory, like F.A. Hayek subscribed to. The idea that rights come out of various agreements of what is and is not allowed in a society. The ones that are exceptionally strong become the concepts of rights and duties. The ones that are a little more weak become your basic etiquette and culture points. I like the social evolutionary argument. That said, though, I don't think that it really holds up to every aspect of rights. What I mean with that is a key portion of rights is not just the fact that they exist or how they function in a society, but also how people interpret them. The interpretation of rights we can see is changing even now as there's more and more push for these positive rights concepts, which if you had talked about them, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, people would have laughed at saying that those things should be rights because the idea of having a right to someone else's service is ludicrous. At least it was. Now it's something that's debated more often and comes up more commonly in conversation regarding the idea of what a right is and isn't. Now, sure, this could be answered as part of social evolution, just society evolving and changing its own definition of rights, but I think that glosses over the individual perspective of what a right is. And I think that that's something that if we take more time to consider, it can help change and shape those types of arguments so that we can shy away from that ludicrous direction of heavy positive rights that are all state forced. But when we get past all that, when it comes to the actual enforcement of rights, the only way to ensure that rights are enforced is through the threat of force or the threat of recourse. So if you have a case where your rights are being violated, right now, that's usually corrected through the state. Right now, if your property has been burglarized, the state sends people to find out who did it, hunt them down, capture them, and then administer some sort of quote-unquote justice to them. I mean, simply throwing them in a cage for several years isn't really justice if you ask me, but my view on the prison system is completely offside from the purpose of this episode, so I'll shelve that for a different day. So the way that the state enforces rights is through the use of force. It's the same way that they enforce any other type of law. The only difference is that for once, something the state enforces is actually in general, to the benefit of its citizenry. 9 times out of 10, it's usually to the detriment, at least if you consider the short list of laws that are actually useful, such as some consumer protections, laws against rape, laws against murder, laws against kidnapping, so on and so forth, versus the complete litany of laws that apply to everything else. But they use force to do it. So in a anarchist society, or in a society where we're against the idea of state force pushing all these things down our throats, how do we ensure a continuation of rights? The way we do that is by being able to be a threat of force in and of ourselves. This is where gun rights become more important, so to speak, than some of the other rights that we have. Gun rights become almost paramount, just below, I would say, forms of, I don't want to say property rights in and of itself, because technically gun rights is a form of property rights. So if we're trying to put it into a different hierarchy, but the mere idea of self-defense, I think, transcends just the idea of property, unless you view property rights as the self-ownership argument of I own myself, therefore the defense of self is a property right because I'm defending the property that is myself. And you end up in this weird recursive loop with that argument, I find. Nothing against people who believe in self-ownership or believe that that's a good positioning for the argument. It just leaves some very weird spots when you get into linguistic arguments regarding it. But I would put gun rights on a higher tier than, say, even freedom of speech or freedom of movement, simply because to defend those types of rights, you need to be able to defend yourself from those that would violate them. The only way to do that is to either be the biggest, strongest guy, in which case As history shows, there's a good chance that you're actually more likely to be the violator than the violatee, or to have a measure of equalization. And as the old adage goes, the gun is the great equalizer. I myself do not own a firearm. I want to be as transparent with that as I can. For where I live, the type of life that I live, and various situations I've been in, it's just not something that I personally have found the need to have. That said, I should have the ability, assuming I have the funds for one, I should have the ability that if I ever feel that my situation in life has changed, and in order to protect myself or those around me that I need to procure one, I should be able to go do so. Same thing for those that already have guns. They should be able to procure the guns in order to protect themselves. And this goes a step further. So when it comes to that idea of right to bear arms, that means that they should be able to do that wherever they are, whenever they are. I mean, we take a look at, I'll look back to the VA rally just a little bit here. Absolutely no casualties, no discharged weapons, no acts of violence, nothing of the sort during the entire event. In the time that there was that rally, I believe I read there was 6 different shootings in Chicago. And Chicago has the tightest gun control regulations in the United States. So you have the area with the most gun control. They have 6 shootings. You have a rally where every single person standing there is carrying a weapon and not a single shot is fired, not even, shoving amongst people there. Like, there was no acts of violence, no nothing. One of the most peaceful gatherings that there's been in recent memory of mass protests in the United States. Almost all of the mass protests so far have ended in either some kind of riot or there's been some sort of physical altercation at it, something. Here you have it where a bunch of people get together to celebrate or to protect their gun rights, and nothing. Absolutely nothing happens. This is one of those situations where it's a proof of concept, first of all, that having a bunch of people together armed, it doesn't mean that there's going to be rampant gun violence just because there's rampant guns. And 2, it also showcases that we can function with people carrying the guns around and not have any incidences. You can have all of the restrictions on that, right? And it's not necessarily going to stop people. It's just going to stop the people that don't care that the restrictions exist. I mean, it's kind of funny. It's kind of the same as the abortion argument. When people talk about banning abortion, the general response to it is, well, people will just get back alley abortions instead. They'll just go black market with it. And they'll make that argument, but still support gun control when it's the exact same logic that causes that problem. It's the exact same logic that leads to that conclusion. That's just one of those cognitive dissonance moments that I find really funny personally. But going back to the main topic at hand, when it comes to gun ownership, or at least as technology advances, or even in previous years before the invention of the gun, the ability to carry defensive measures with you at all times is important. Now, under the general concept of property rights, it doesn't necessarily have to be for defense. This is the other aspect of the gun argument where you're not seeing out-and-out bans on guns. I mean, you're starting to, but usually that hasn't been the case with gun control measures. More often it's been restrictions on what kind of guns you can have, what kind of accessories you can have. Like that stupid banning of bump stocks from a couple years back, or all of the hubbubaloo around, the AR-15 rifle. It shouldn't matter which weapon it is. Yes, do you need an AR-15? No. But you know what? Rosa Parks didn't need to sit on the back of the bus, didn't need to sit on the front of the bus either. She could have sat at the back, but it's not about that. It's about what you have a right to do. You should have a right to have any type of property you choose. If you have money and it's available to market, you should be able to purchase it. You should be able to own it, and you should be able to use it as you please. It doesn't matter if it's a lawnmower. It doesn't matter if it is a new pair of shoes. It doesn't matter if it's a rifle. It can't really be said more plainly than that. Now, granted, I would question the logic of someone walking around with an assault rifle everywhere. I would question the logic of that. I don't see a purpose in it. But seeing a purpose in it isn't the point. The point is whether or not a person should have a right to do it. The gun right ends up being a twofold issue because at its core, it's a property right, but it's also a measure that's used to protect your other rights. You can see the same thing with, let's say, the protests in Hong Kong right now. A lot of the protesters, with some of the signs and different things like that they've been using, they really push that they would be better off if they had the same kind of gun rights that America has. Even with the restrictions that are on American gun ownership, if they had the same kind of rights to firearms, they would not be in the kind of oppressed position that they are currently. They know that. They can see that just by observing history, the importance of having that ability to equalize yourself. Equalize yourself against your fellow man that may wish you harm, and against your government, which most likely does. The defense aspect is one, the property right aspect is another. And this is regardless of how you view the right, whether you view that type of defense as a natural right, whether it's the constitutional aspect, whether you want to make the God-given right argument, whether it's just society's evolved to have this right. It doesn't matter how you reach the existence of a right to bear arms. People view it nowadays either very stringently by the Second Amendment under the constitutional term, or the people that are against it view it as something very archaic, something that's not necessary anymore. The idea that rights will just be defended because rights will just be defended, which history proves wrong. History has a very, very clear and succinct message when it comes to an armed populace. The government does not screw around when it comes to an armed populace. They try not to piss off their armed populace, because otherwise the guillotine comes out, and no government wants that. When it comes to discussions on gun rights, for any of the discussions that you may have in the future there, it's important to get that core message across. It's not just about, I want to have this nice flashy toy. That tunes it down. And we don't need to start the argument off by saying that I need to own a gun in order to be able to shoot tyrants. Because at that point, people who don't agree with you, or people who are on the opposite end of the spectrum with this argument, they're going to see that and say, okay, this guy's a loon who thinks he's going to go around shooting cops and soldiers. Okay, never mind. We shouldn't talk about this guy. We should ignore him. And that just tells me I'm more right about being against it. We need to talk about it as a measure of defensive rights. It is a right that defends other rights. You have a right to property? Great. How do you protect that property? Well, you can't do that if you don't have a right to defend yourself. If you lose that right to defend yourself, the others can collapse easily behind it. Now, we can say that, we can hope that the government will do what it can, but we know that that's a pipe dream. I mean, the fact that you have to have a government where it started off with a constitution to protect its populace from its government, which the entire idea of constitutional law, that is its basis. The basis of constitutional law is to defend the public from the government. If your entire country is built on that idea that people need that protection, how can anyone trust to hand it all over to the body that the country was designed to protect itself against? It's one of those glaringly obvious things where we get so caught up in the minutia of the arguments or small statistics, little changes here and there, that we forget the core of the idea. The core of the idea is that it's about being able to protect the rights you have and ensuring that there is a way to preserve them for all of society. That way you don't end up with small select groups having small select rights. Everybody ends up with their rights protected. And for those that try to violate them, you have a way of dealing with it. That's just about everything I got to say here today on this one. For everyone that's listening, of course, you can follow my author page on Facebook, just Killian Hobbs-author, which I have to say, we just passed the 3,400 mark. So really glad to see everybody out there paying attention to different memes or articles, podcasts, stuff like that I post on there. So I'm glad to have any and all of you that are following. Otherwise, if you have any questions or questions, comments, concerns, any of that sort of stuff, feel free to message the page. I'm pretty quick to respond, so I can send everything in through there. Otherwise, if you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, I'll see you again next week.